Hello and welcome to my analysis of Game 6 of the 2018 Chess World Championship. Magnus Carlsen, the defending champion, played the white pieces in this game, and Fabiano Caruana played the black pieces. This game was very interesting because it deviated away from the opening lines the players had been playing up to this point, and really took the game into uncharted territory in terms of what we'd seen so far in the World Championship, and created all sorts of tactical, interesting options in the early phase of the game. And on top of that, it ended with a grand finale that was extremely close to being a loss for the World Champion. And so let's get into the game. Begins with e4, which is met by e5. This had been a standard defence employed by Caruana up to this point in the World Championship. f3 was also very normal from Carlsen. And this is the unusual move, f6. This basically, a lot of the time players will develop the knight over here on c6, so that it protects the pawn which is under threat from the newly developed white knight. But in this case, the black knight develops simply mirroring the threat that white poses. The threat is to capture the pawn here on e5, black threatens to capture the pawn here on e4. This is called the Petrov, and it leads to some interesting lines, as we'll see. Capture. The pawn moves forward, developing, basically forcing the knight to move away and opening up the light-squared line here for this bishop to get involved in the game. The knight relocates. The black knight then recaptures so that they are equal in material. The queen comes here. The idea behind this is queen comes to e2 because it now pins the knight on the square that it's currently occupying, because you can't move your king into a threatened position. And of course, if this knight moves, the queen is threatening the king, so it would be an illegal move for this black knight on e4 to move. Usually when you win material from a player, it's because you've pinned a piece in place and then sort of ganged up on it with your pieces, and you're able to win it. So this pin isn't very pleasant for black. He then brings his queen in here, which not only gives protection to the knight, but it also allows it to move, because now it's also guarding the king, sitting directly in front of it. The white knight moves to f4, and now this black knight develops to c6. And this was an unusual move in the game, a bit of an unexpected one, because white can pose some very serious threats to black, as we'll see. He's essentially, black is allowing white to bring his knight to d5, which he does. And as soon as he does that, the problems basically are as follows. This knight is threatening to capture the pawn on c7. If it did that, it would be threatening the king and the rook simultaneously. So black would have to move his king and then lose his rook, and the game would just be lost. But the only thing preventing that is this black queen, which is up here on e7. This is guarding this pawn, which means that whatever black does now, he has to leave that queen in a place where it's guarding this pawn. That means the square it's on, d7 or d8. Now, it can't go to d7 or d8, because then it's no longer guarding this knight down here on e4, which means the queen would just capture the knight and check the king at the same time. And that would just mean that white was ahead by a knight, and the game would basically be over. White would convert that into a victory, as all grandmasters would at this level. So really, the black queen has to basically stay where it is, but it can't stay where it is because the knight is threatening to capture the queen here. So it seems to be an unsolvable problem for black. But what Caruana does is he simply moves his knight in here to d4, threatening similar problems for white. I mean, there's a move here that on the surface looks very good for white. If white were to move his queen up here to c4, he's now threatening this knight, which would be lost if it isn't moved on the very next move. But he's also adding extra threats on this important c7 square that the knight is occupying. That means that black would have to solve the problem of this knight being under threat, and at the same time solve the problem that if he doesn't add more defenders on this square, white's simply going to capture the pawn, threaten the king and rook, as discussed before, and then it doesn't matter that the queen's defending it, because if the queen captures, the white queen, if it were here on c4, would then recapture the black queen, winning the game. So really there's all sorts of tactical threats going on. The problem with that is, if the white queen were to move here, now something very nasty suddenly happens. It seems like an inescapable problem for black. However, if this were to move to c3, this black knight, it would, assuming this white queen is over here on c4, if this knight moves to c3, the black queen would be putting the white king in check, which is a problem that white would immediately have to solve, which means that the pawn or the queen here wouldn't be able to capture this knight that was on the c3 square. Would have to solve the problem of being in check first. And there really isn't any way that white can solve that other than to use this knight to capture the queen that's threatening the king. So you might think, well, okay, white can just capture the queen and the problem is solved. But in actual fact, if that were to happen, this knight would be here, and the other knight would jump in here, giving check, capturing this pawn, forking the king and the rook, and not only that, but also with this knight already here on c3, covering these two squares, it would actually be checkmate. So that might sound very complicated, and I do apologise for that, but the truth of the matter is this position tactically is just filled with traps and is complex in its nature. So the capture takes place, and black recaptures here. White didn't fall into the trap, of course, of moving his queen up here to c4 to support the attack on the c7 square. He simply decided to trade off the queens. And normally at the very highest level among grandmasters, when you trade off the queens, the most important attacking piece on the board for both players is gone, which often sort of takes the edge off the game and normally leads to draws in a lot of cases. Then the knight's maneuver and attempt to reposition. Pawn kicks the knight away. And another pawn move. This is always one of the dangers of having major pieces in your opponent's half of the board early in the game. Often like a small pawn move, such as this one here on d4 or the one here on f3, can start kicking those pieces away, meaning they have to be moved somewhere else, otherwise they'll be captured. So you drive those pieces back out of the opposing half of the board, but you also develop pawns, and developing your pieces in a way where they're laying claim to central squares is a positional plus in the long run. And black starts to get up to the same tricks with the pawn development to c6, kicking the knight away, repositioning knights, and then finally we have a bishop move. And this basically clears the way for white to castle. This knight gets off the edge of the board first, however, because it's just in a very ugly position where it doesn't really influence the game. You can't move to b5 because the pawn's covering it. You can't move to c4 because the pawn's covering it. So rerouting the knight this way to get it into the game is the only viable option. And the bishop comes in to threaten the knight here on f4. capture. And instead of castling, white now moves his king up to f2. Castling is more important when the queens are on the board because they pose a big attacking threat. So white is basically just happy to move his king forwards and develop that instead. Open pawns. The knight being repositioned here, getting into the game. And similarly, this knight, which was kind of out of the game a little bit, is rerouting now. Okay, the threat here was black pushing his pawn up to c4. White basically preempts that by moving his bishop back. He now wants to potentially pose threats by moving it to a4, putting the king in check, which is an option that's only just become available because this pawn has moved forward from the c6 square. It's an important lesson to be learned about pawn moves in chess here, that pawns can't move backwards. So once you move a pawn forwards, you often leave weaknesses behind it that your opponent can exploit. And black castles. White brings his rook into the game. The idea behind this is essentially if black were to capture here on d4, white recaptures with this c pawn, material would be equal, but I mean, white would have a pawn that didn't have any pawns on either side of it, which could move up and protect it in a chain like we've got here. From the b pawn to the d pawn, there's a nice chain forming where they protect each other. But whenever you have an isolated pawn with no pawn on either file, either side of it, it becomes a target later in the game and can become a liability. So the rook move here ensures that if the black pawn captures here, the rook recaptures, meaning that there are no isolated pawns in the centre of the board, which is a positional positive that white wants to maintain. The rook moves to give more firepower down that file. The knight moves out of the way, clearing the path for this dark squared bishop here to essentially affect the game. Captures. And white strangely opted to recapture with the c-pawn rather than the rook. I mean, one of the other reasons why the commentary team who was covering this expected the recapture to be with the rook was because, well, precisely the threat that's happened. Now that this pawn is out of the way, the two bishops here on this file are now going to be put under pressure by this rook. So it was an unusual move by Carlsen. He obviously does have a plan in mind. Another thing, the bishop. Knight comes into play. And the other bishop attacks the dark squared bishop on d6. This is really like a move which helps white's development in a way. If black captures the bishop, instead of recapturing the pawn, white recaptures with the knight, and then he is threatening this isolated pawn here, as well as attacking the light squared bishop and this pawn over here, which is inadequately protected. So he's offering a simple trade of bishops, which would be sort of equal material on the surface, but it would then create threats in the very next move against black. Repositioning the knight, as we've seen a lot during this game. This challenges control of the c-file. Black would capture here, the white rook would recapture, and there would be equal material, but white would then have control of this open file. Bishop comes in here. White retreats. Now the black knight comes in here. Now this is a bit of a complicated position again that's developed. There's a threat here of the knight simply capturing her on b2 for the start. Probably the most obvious way to defend against this is to move the pawn forwards, out of harm's way where it's protected by another pawn and also is attacking the piece that was attacking it. That seems like the logical continuation. But then certain threats start to be posed. For instance, that leaves a hole here in the b2 square, which means the dark square bishop can move into here, pose threats here against this rook. And then, as soon as this rook moves out of the way, the dark square bishop would move onto the empty b2 square, threatening this rook. If that were to then move to the only square that it could to escape, the light square bishop comes in here, threatening this rook on b1, and the rook is lost. I mean, the black bishop would be captured in turn, but rooks are worth slightly more material than the bishop is, so this would be a really important turning point if this did happen. And it's a nice little tactical trick. The knight moves in first. This is slightly just another way of doing the same thing, more or less. I mean, it's just a slightly less straightforward way of doing it. But the knight comes in first. The bishop then comes in here, threatening the rook on a1. It can't be captured with this rook because the black rook would recapture, and then white would be down on the exchange in the same way as before. He would have lost the dark square bishop, but white would have lost a rook. And of course, if the bishop moves to c3 here, threatening the rook, and the rook moves to b1, he wouldn't need to employ the light square bishop to capture it sort of straight away. I mean, he could capture it with the knight once it lands there, but then he would be recaptured by this rook. So in order to add extra protection, this light square bishop would come in again, adding some firepower to the b1 square and winning the exchange that way. Rooks are traded off, which is the logical way to solve the problem for white. And this gives more room for this rook to get itself out of trouble. At the core of this problem that was going to result in white losing material was the fact that this rook was trapped on one of two squares. For trading off two rooks which were of equal value and then moving this rook over to the third square that's now been vacated, it frees up room for itself and resolves the problem. And so the knight relocates as it wasn't able to do the job that it hoped to, threatening this isolated d4 pawn, which has become a target, which was expected. Rook trade. The knight fits itself into the game. This is basically saying, if you capture my isolated pawn on d4, I'm just going to capture your isolated pawn on d5 and we'll be equal. Although once I've captured this pawn, I'll be threatening your dark square bishop here, which is a problem you'll have to then solve on the next move. That means that white is able to capture with a tempo, it's called, in chess. If you can capture a piece and have the initiative, just force your opponents to make a certain type of move on the next move, and you've got the initiative. Develops. Bishop starts to pose threats over here towards the king side. This is threatening to capture the a7 pawn, which is fairly difficult for black to defend. I mean, the knight can come back to here, which would be okay. He would be able to defend it with the light square bishop, the dark square bishop at this point because of this pawn here. The other option is to just move the piece which is in danger, which Caruana chooses to do. 4, light square bishop to d7, f5, just rolling the pawns forward here towards the king side. Once the pawns start arriving here, they'll start wreaking havoc in the remaining defences around the black king, which is always going to be a headache. And the light square bishop could capture it and solve the problem, but the light knight here and the white knight would recapture the bishop and start posing more threats. Give some protection to the isolated pawn on d5, which is under siege. The bishop grabs the pawn over here, but there's no problem for black, who simply puts white in check here, supported by the pawn, and then the bishop captures, which regains material parity. Bishop comes in to support the knight, which is under threat here on e3. And the bishop backs up to c5 to clear the way for this pawn to start pushing forwards to d4, threatening the knight again. This bishop comes in here to threaten the knight here on e4. The idea is, if this d5 pawn does push forwards, it no longer protects this knight, which means that a capture could occur here. And of course the bishop could recapture, but all sorts of tactical complexities then start to come into play. It all comes down to pressure really around the centre here. All the pieces are all gathering and congregating around this pawn, applying pressure. And this is where Magnus Carlsen actually makes a mistake. He decides to start exchanging off pieces in this pressure cooker in the centre of the board. But black finds a novel way to mix up the order in which the pieces are taken, which actually Carlsen clearly didn't see. Instead of recapturing the light squared bishop with this light squared bishop, the dark squared bishop takes the knight first, threatening this bishop here, which means now both bishops are face to face, threatening each other. So white captures, black recaptures, and now white grabs a pawn, black gets his bishop out of danger, and black is now ahead by a major piece. He's come out of that exchange, which just goes to show how difficult it can be to calculate exchanges of material. I mean, it looked like a situation where if the pieces were traded off, it would just be equal material for both sides. But one slight deviation in the order in which the pieces were traded creates a situation where one side ends up with a material advantage, as seen here. And white manages to get some compensation by taking a few extra pawns here. And now, in material terms, a knight or a bishop is worth 3 points, and a pawn is worth 1. So there is actually material equality here, even though there is an extra major piece. But it's a bit of an interesting imbalance that the players are going to have to navigate their way through. The pawns start to push upwards towards the king. And this is an interesting example of blockading, something that Carlsen later said in the post-match press conference that he overlooked. The black bishop comes in here, blockading his pawn from moving anywhere. And once it is blockaded, it's very hard for white to defend that pawn now. The next move, very shortly, is going to be knight to c3. And that now attacks a pawn here, which is blockaded. The light squared bishop can't navigate its way around to b1 to protect it in time. And instead he opts to push the other pawn forwards, and black captures that one instead. He was always going to capture either one of the pawns, no matter what white did at that point. The king comes up the board, the knight relocates, and it couldn't grab the other pawn there because, of course, the light squared bishop would recapture the knight. Here we come to the very interesting endgame. Carlsen, the defending champion, is now slightly down on material because he's lost that extra pawn. But it is a situation that he might be able to hold, although he's going to have to play very accurately. King moving up with the pawns to try and create some sort of threats over here on the king side. And here is a strange position where White is basically hoping to get himself in here, g6, and then he can move his king back and forwards between h7 and g6. And at first glance, most players probably wouldn't notice it, but if White can do that, then it's pretty much impossible for Black to actually make any progress in the game. He does have these two minor pieces here, but he can't really force White to checkmate. You can't force his king out of this little area here, and White could end up rescuing a draw that way. It's called a fortress in chess. It's a situation that arises from time to time, but it's fairly unusual to find like a little pocket of space in a structure of pawns where you can move your king back and forwards, and your opponent can never make progress, even though they have an extra major piece. But in order to do that, White needs to think about this pawn here on h4. If his king moves to g6, the bishop simply captures the pawn on h4, and then White probably doesn't have enough cover to protect his king in the fortress. So he needs to find a way to get his king here and bring this pawn up behind the king to shut the door to the fortress. But as soon as he moves his king, he'll lose the pawn, so it's just a very difficult situation that you think doesn't have an answer to solve. But this shows the brilliance of the world champion, who knows that this pawn is very isolated, it's just out here on the other side of the board. It's going to be very difficult for him to defend this in the long run. He makes a few threats here against the knight, just to kick that knight away. But then he decides to not even try and defend this pawn over on the a file. He just moves it forward into the line of fire and throws the pawn to the wolves, really, and says, capture this pawn, have an extra piece, which gives him even more of a material deficit. But he knows by now that the only thing that matters is getting the door to this fortress closed and getting his king in here where he can move back and forwards, and his opponent just can't ever win the game. Black captures. Trade of pawns here. This is quite important because it means that Black can't really get a knight or a bishop onto this square to pose any threat. It sort of blocks the angles at which Black can attack the king once it's in its fortress. But anyway, the pawn was sacrificed on the a file, the exchange of pawns there, and then the king moves up. And if the bishop was to come back here to threaten this pawn over an h4, well, it's too late now because the pawn would then jump forward to h5, securing the white king in its precarious looking fortress. Black attempts to make progress, but anywhere, if he leaves the knight there, it's going to be traded off. If he moves it anywhere in here, the king's going to capture it. If he moves it to this square on g5, the pawn's going to capture it. So he just can't really get his knight into a position where he can check the king and push the king out of the fortress. And as long as the king stays in the light square, back and forwards here, well, the dark square bishop can never touch it either. And that really is the key here. The knight just can't really maneuver into a square where it can pressure the white king, and the dark square bishop can't touch it as long as it stays on light squares. And there's a lot of manoeuvring here. The game goes on for well over 100 moves. And strangely enough, I believe it's at this point the computer engines that were calculating, countless moves ahead, and the commentators in the studio were having a look. And at one point, I think it was here, Black could have forced a checkmate in 35 moves if he'd made the exact correct moves. And that came about by this one king move here, a particular moment where other pieces were arranged in a particular way that a computer can see that, but a human being is never going to be able to. Caruana had, I think, less than 10 minutes on his clock at this point as well, so if he had managed to find this forced win, he would have been a very worthy new world champion, that's for sure. But he simply moves the bishop, and it all just peters out, and the players agree to a draw. And the world champion Magnus Carlsen clings on by the skin of his teeth through finding a fortunate little fortress among these pawns in the corner of the board, which he managed to get his king into by sacrificing a pawn over on the a-file. All of that came in the wake of some very fascinating tactical manoeuvrings with the knights in the opening, and made for a true